All right, welcome back to the lab. If you know, you know. We're going to be talking about the groups for the 6 Charlotte Major. These were just announced yesterday, and here they are. We have 4 groups with 4 teams per group. The format is best of 1, double round robin. So each team will play against each other team in their group twice, both in best of 1s. They'll be awarded points based on the result of each game. 3 points for a regulation win, 2 points for an overtime win, 1 point for an overtime loss, and 0 points for a regulation loss. And then the top 2 teams from each group will be seeded into a single elimination bracket. If there's any ties in terms of points, there are tiebreaker metrics, but that's not something we really need to discuss here. Once we're in the bracket, it's going to be all best of 3s in the quarterfinals and the semifinals, and then a best 3 out of 5 grand final. Something we should note here is the fact that they changed how the draw works in regards to regions. So we still have a first, second, third, and fourth seed from any given region in each group, but they changed the cap for how many teams can be from one region in a group. So before, it was just capped at 1. Each group had 1 team per region, that being NA, LATAM, EU, and APAC. But now they changed it to where there can be 2 teams from any given region in any given group. It's not a guarantee that this would happen, but it breaks down to be extremely likely to happen at least once. And we do actually see it happen in every single group here. And it happens to every region except for NA. So looking at Group A here, we have Elevate and Direwolves, both from APAC. In Group B, Liquid and Furia, both from LATAM. In Group C, Heroic and G2, both from EU. And then in Group D, BDS and LFO, also both from EU. So EU is only present in 2 of the groups. LATAM and APAC are each present in 3 of the groups, so they're only absent from 1. And we have 1 NA team in each group. So is there a little bit of a conspiracy here? I don't know. At the NA Major, all 4 of the NA teams will not have to go up against each other, and thus sort of increasing their odds of all making it out of the group, or at least none of them having the ability to hamper each other's chances of making it out of the group. Now, it's still possible for any given region to have all 4 of their teams make it out of groups. It's just much harder for, especially EU. So they would have to get top 2 in both Group D and C. So Heroic and G2 would have to top Group C in some order, and then BDS and LFO would both have to top Group D in some order in order for all of the European teams to make it out. So a little bit curious of a decision to make. I mean, everyone seemed to be really happy with the way it was before, where we got to see the maximum number of inter-region matchups. There were no matchups of teams playing against teams from the same region. Maybe you would see it in the playoffs, but you would never see it in the groups. But now we're going to see a lot of it, and it's just super strange. I don't know why they did it, and they'll probably revert it at some point because everyone hates it. Some people are okay with it, and everyone else hates it. Like, nobody's like, oh yeah, this is great. I mean, everyone, it's really a matter of neutrality or disdain for the thing. So I guess enough about that. Let's just quickly run down each of the groups, each of the team in each group, and talk about them a little bit. Okay, starting in Group A, we have Elevate, first seed from APAC. They were also the most successful APAC team last year in terms of international play that's at this event. So Damwon's not here, so APAC's perhaps greatest hope not present at this event, and so maybe that falls on Elevate's shoulder instead. Yeah, they're coming in as the first seed, and I'd say probably Group A or D look like the weakest group. If I had to call one, I guess I'd say Group A looks the weakest, and then Group D, and then if I continue, probably B and C looks like the group of death, but it's pretty hard to call. It could also be Group B, and then it's not even like a massive margin of how much tougher any given group will be than the next toughest group. Okay, so, right. Yeah, Elevate, if you are a big APAC fan, maybe that's the team to cheer for. Oxygen, coming in as the second seed from NA. For a while, it looks like they might have been the first seed, and then we have a lot of experience here. We have Vertical, Laxing, and Foxay coming in, being joined by Dream, who doesn't have any international experience, but has been playing for a while, and then Newers, who has no experience in any regard, very much so. So just an absolute new kind of player, but very talented. So, high hopes for this roster, but we'll see what they can get done. Direwolves, third seed from APAC, and part of the reason I think this group is weakest is because it has the 2 APAC teams. Not to say that APAC is necessarily that weak, but it seems like they're probably the weakest region at this point with what happened last year, and then at SI, maybe it's Europe, and maybe we'll have to recontextualize things after this event, but for now it seems like maybe APAC is the weakest, if not by a massive margin. Direwolves were, I think, the only team to go flawless in the regular season. They went 7-0, whereas a few teams went nearly flawless, but again, they're the only one, so keep a lookout for them. Maybe they'll really flourish in this best of 1 in the best of one format like they did in their league. And then we have Team 1, and this isn't your father's Team 1. Ligonis is still here, and he is one of only 2 players at this event that could repeat from last year. So he's here on Team 1, and so Team 1, I guess, is the only org that can repeat from last year because Nip's not here, TSM's not here, and FaZe isn't here. So Team 1 can, but again, it's a different team. And then Alamau is the other player that could repeat from last year. He was on Team 1 with Ligonis. He's now on G2. So even though they are a 4th seed, I think probably LATAM remains the deepest region, and so any of their seeds has a really good shot of showing out. So don't sleep on them just because they're a 4th seed, and they're also in, I'd say, one of the weaker groups. It's entirely possible it'll be Auction and Team 1 emerging from this group. All right, looking at Group B, we have Liquid coming in as the 1st seed from LATAM. They didn't end 1st place in the regular season, but they managed to take down the Copa Elite 6 and thus get 1st place. These guys are still looking for a title. I guess Liquid won something way back in the day, and I think, Nesk and PSK were both on that roster, but Palu continues to look for a title, and Ask in resets, although they're newer, of course, they want a title as well. This team, in its 2 different variations last year, got pretty close to a few titles, but never quite made it. They were sort of a lot of people's favorite at SI, at the most recent SI, but they didn't end up taking it down. They fell a bit prematurely, and I'd say they're probably one of the favorites for this event. And then we have Cyclops, maybe not APAC's greatest hope, if that's still Elevate, but, maybe, well, they are a fan favorite, I'd say. Canadian's been very vocal about how he really likes to watch these guys play and react and whatever. And, maybe this is the meta where they'll finally thrive. They never made it out of groups in any event they went to last year, so, grouped in the Mexico Major just by the most narrow margin, and then grouped at SI as well, but that was sort of deemed the group of death, so maybe this is where they finally get out of groups. Maybe they'll even make a deep bracket run. We'll have to see, but regardless, it'll be very fun to watch. Furia was a perennial, not underachiever, and I guess not even overachiever. They were pretty mid overall, but mid in terms of teams going to the events. They went to, if I remember right, all of the events. They now have some roster moves, and perhaps this is the event where they can make a deep run. They didn't always make it out of groups, but the only time they didn't make it out of groups, if I remember right, last year was when they were in a group of death for the Sweden Major. So maybe the roster moves is exactly what they need, but regardless, it's still the 3rd seed coming out of perhaps still the strongest region. So be on the lookout for these guys. And then we have XSET. So Group B is sort of the Brazilian group because both these teams are just from Brazil. And then XSET has 3 Brazilian players, as well as both of their coaches are Brazilian as well. So a lot of Brazilians here. We're going to see some amount of Brazilians going out from this group because only 2 teams can emerge. Yeah, XSET 4th seed from NA, but don't sleep on them. It looked like at certain points they might end up being the 2nd or 3rd seed. Their record was only 5-4, but they only lost 2 of those games were max overtime losses to Oxygen and to Astralis, the top 2 teams from the region, and then the other 2 losses were just 2 pretty solid teams in the very first week. So they just needed a little bit of time to wake up. They were a brand new team, and then they were insanely good after that. So maybe they'll keep their streak alive, even though technically I guess the streak got ended, but they were still super hot, just very narrowly losing the games that they did lose. And there's some experience on this team even. Kino and Yaga have played at several international events. Spirits has played at one, and then there's also just a lot of talent on the team. So, if I said watch out for the 4th seed from LATAM, I think that's also true for NA here. Moving on to Group C. This group looked extremely scary. Heroic absolutely dominated EUL. The only game that they lost was against Na'Vi, a little bit of a puzzling one. It was sort of early in this stage, and so maybe that's what caused it. It's unclear, but they never lost another game, never lost another point after that. And same sort of thing with W7M. They absolutely dominated the region. I think they only dropped 3 points overall, and 1 was in an overtime win, and I think 1 was an overtime loss, and that was like max overtime, so they just narrowly lost 1 game. And these guys came out of nowhere. They were facing relegation last year, and now they're here. And then Heroic, they weren't bad last year. They would have qualified for the major in stage 1 had there been a major corresponding to that. And then they fell off a little bit, didn't do quite as well in stage 2 and 3, but now they have Uno in for Anarchic, and they have a new org, and they look insanely good. I think their success could also be attributed some amount to the weakening of Europe, BDS sort of carrying some bad mojo on from SI, it seemed, in the first half of the stage, and Empire being completely blown up. So the 2 best teams in Europe were crippled to varying degrees, and Heroic took advantage of it. And let's see if they can continue their magic here, or if it is a lot to do with the fact that Europe is seemingly one of the weaker regions. And then, once again, W7M, I think, is one of the teams people are most excited to see play against other regions and just play in general, because the whole thing where nobody there's no more English cast for Brazil, so people don't get to watch it that much unless somebody co-streams or whatever. But okay, moving on. Dark Zero. I'd say some amount underdogs in this group, but don't sleep on them. I still think they have a decent possibility of making it out of this group. It's probably going to be two of these three. G2 seems the least likely, but still possible. But again, don't sleep on Dark Zero. They had a few questionable games, almost losing to Beast Coast, losing to Parabellum, but they do have a solid win over Oxygen. They got that win over Space Station in the final day to go to this event. They went to overtime with Astralis. If things had gone a little bit differently, they could have won. And so, definitely a force to be reckoned with. And Canadian on land, nothing to be trifled with indeed. I'm not prepared to make my predictions just yet. I'm going to have to ponder and pore over my tomes just a bit, but it's entirely possible I might be predicting Dark Zero to make it out of this group. And then that leaves G2, 4th seed from EU, one of the weaker looking regions. And they could have ended up being in 2nd place if they just beat BDS in that last playday, but instead they got crushed by BDS, so they're coming in on a rather low note, I suppose. And the amount of talent on this team is perhaps exceeded by no other team, maybe a few other teams. It's tough to say. There's like Liquid and stuff, but G2, absolute superstars, and it seems like they kind of have the roles right. Maybe they just need a little bit more time, but they did throw this team together and then immediately make it to the major. But they are facing a pretty tough group. They were sort of gifted the major. If Rogue had beat Heroic in regulation, they didn't actually beat them at all. But if they had beat them in regulation, it'd be Rogue here instead. So G2, not to be slept on, but I still do think exceedingly unlikely to make it out of this group here. And then finally, we have Group D. Astralis, top team coming out of NA, but I think there's a few caveats there. Do keep in mind, they did lose to Oxygen. That was their only loss, but they also had to beat Dark Zero and Xset both in overtime. So all the other teams here, they don't have any decisive wins. They do have 2 wins and then 1 loss, but again, no decisive wins because they did have to come in overtime. So perhaps NA has a little bit of ways to go. We'll see how they stack up to especially LATAM, but the other regions. But besides a few like minor slip-ups in all the other games against pretty much every other team, they looked insanely good. They destroyed some teams. They handled some teams maybe more easily than they were expected to. And I mean, they just look really good. They were a pretty strong team last year, or it seemed like they should be a strong team. They did falter sort of in stage 3. They were even close to facing relegation at one point, but they didn't end up having to do that. And then they swapped out Retro for Forest, and they swapped out Easily for Callout. And especially the coaching change seems to have really benefited them. So let's see how they can do at their very first LAN. I think Shuttle's been to an international LAN way back when, but I think everyone else on this team is fresh to international play in terms of at an actual event. Okay, and then we have BDS, so still probably one of the favorites to win the event. They generally are, even though they never win, but maybe this will be the one. This even looks like maybe one of the easier events we've seen recently. And so BDS, I mentioned before, they sort of carried over that bad mojo from SI. It seemed to be affecting them, or maybe it was just other things. It could have been the maps, the meta, whatever. Something seemed to be hampering them a little bit in the first half of the stage, but they really picked it up. They got, a 7-1 on Outsiders / Virtus Pro, and that's a pretty solid team to take down. And then even the very last day, 7-1 over G2, complete destruction. Really good note to come into the major on, and I mean, still a force to be reckoned with. I just don't doubt them at all, even though they got 2nd place by a pretty wide margin. If they had won against Heroic, these guys would have tied on points. So Heroic had 24 points, BDS had 18, and then Heroic did beat BDS 7-5. So say BDS beat Heroic 7-5, then they'd be tied on points. I'm not 100% sure who would have been first place based on tiebreakers off the top of my head, but right. They were very close-ish to still being the top team in Europe despite a few slip-ups, and very clearly I think they were the 2nd best team over the course of the stage. Everyone else sort of fumbled around for 3rd and 4th, and sure, I mean, even going into that last day, they might not have made the major, but they were pretty likely to. So yeah, definitely watch out for these guys. One of the most experienced squads here in terms of all 5 of them playing at events and just in general, right? So, I mean, like Oxygen has some experienced players, but some new players as well. Liquid, even though they've had this roster for a little while now, still 2 of the players are relatively inexperienced, so things like this. BDS has been this same 5 for quite a while, and they've been lethal for quite a while. And then, okay, so LFO, the other French team in Europe, but not a French org. They're looking for an org still, and so they have a lot to prove. Be on the lookout for these guys. They're perhaps the least interesting team disregarding that from Europe, with Heroic's meteoric rise, G2 being G2, and BDS being BDS. But right, these guys, they want an org, and they're hungry to win regardless. They just picked up Mowgli, and they look really good, so definitely don't sleep on these guys, even though I imagine some people will. And then finally we have Chiefs, and not too much to say about the Chiefs. You know, they went to one event last year, but they went out in groups. I think they got third place in that group, but it was above Oxygen, right, who was playing absolutely neutered. So it doesn't really count for much, and it's not like they made it out of the group anyway. So looking for some redemption there. They'd love to make it out of the group, but it does seem unlikely. The 4th seed coming out of probably the weakest region, but still, nobody is to be slept on at this event. Everyone is here for a reason. And I guess that does it. You know, we'll have predictions and other stuff coming soon. I'll talk more in depth about all these guys, but that's sort of a brief-ish overview. It probably will end up being pretty long anyways. I don't have the total runtime in front of me. But okay, so with all of that being said, if you guys would, you know, leave me a sub, like, comment, whatever, it's appreciated, and I will catch you guys in the next video.